Welcome to this training video for Circles of Support and Accountability. My name is Dr. Robin Wilson, and this video was produced in conjunction with the US Department of Justice and is part of a greater project regarding Circles of Support and Accountability. Today's topic is self-care and burnout, and this video is intended to provide some training information for people who care to volunteer in circles or others who are involved in circles projects, although we realize that this may appeal to other people who are not necessarily involved in a CoSA project. And if you find this video on the internet and it's of some use to you, feel free to use it in any way you like. I should also note that there is a PowerPoint that is associated with this video, which you can obtain either from the US DOJ website, from the Circles of Support and Accountability Project, or you can obtain it from my own personal website, which is www.robinjwilson.com. And again, feel free to use this for whatever purpose you see fit. As I said, today we're going to be talking about self-care and burnout. And this is a particularly important thing to talk about for people who are working with others who have engaged in sexual violence. We know that the sorts of behaviors that our core members have been engaged in can sometimes be quite troubling. And hearing about them can be almost victimizing, in itself. Of course, not to the same degree that the people who are involved in the offenses would have experienced, but to have ordinary citizens, like many of our circle volunteers are, to sit in a room and listen to somebody talk about something that's quite, at times, horrendous and certainly damaging to others, can certainly take a toll on you. And we want to make sure that we protect our volunteers from self-care issues and from burnout and from vicarious harm. We want to make sure that everybody who is involved in a Circles project can still maintain their own personal, physical and mental well-being. I guess for me, it always starts out with, why do we do what we do? So at some point in my life, I made a decision to go into forensic psychology and to work in what I call essentially sexual violence prevention. I've been working with people who have engaged in sexual violence for more than 33 years at this point. And if I was honest with myself, I'd have to say that at times, many of the stories that I've heard from some of my clients or that I've heard from victims that my clients have harmed have really troubled me. And at times I've asked myself, why do I do what I do? Why do I submit myself to this? And I think when it comes right down to it, I do this because I believe in community safety. I believe in trying to make a difference and in trying to ensure that the world is a safer place for my family and friends and others. And I think that we have to acknowledge that the work we do takes a toll on us, whether you are a volunteer or a psychologist or a probation officer or a police officer, anybody who interacts with the forensic psychological world, and especially with sexual violence prevention, has to acknowledge that every once in a while, the stuff you hear about or the stuff that you experience has an effect on you. We know that some of our core members, because of their backgrounds, some of them came from very troubled households. Some of them have learned through experience that the best way to get what you want is to act up or to do something extreme. And there's absolutely no denying that there are times when our core members will definitely push our buttons. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. I think what we need to ask ourselves is, can we be helpful to our core members while still maintaining some sense of sanity and some sense of what's right and purposeful in the world, and not to let our anger and our horror at some of the acts that our core members have engaged in affect how we are able to work with them in trying to help them become the best people they can be and for there to be no more victims. I think, for me at least, and I'm sure for many of you as well, that the Circle's motto, "No more victims," is probably front and center in the reason why you're involved in this project, and the reason why you do what you do. I think we believe also that our core members have a right to proper care, that they have a right to have people who care about them, that they have a right to good treatment, to good risk management, and all those sorts of things. And the only way we're going to do that is by engaging with them on a day-to-day basis, face-to-face. It's not the sort of thing we can do by proxy. We want our core members to establish lives that are healthy and free of risk, and that they can, sort of engage in behaviors much like the rest of us in the community. We want them to be balanced. We want them to have a broad experience of life, and we want them to enjoy some degree of self-determinism. Now, self-determinism, that's one of those fancy psychological words, but really what that means is being able to make decisions for yourself and knowing that the decisions you're making for yourself are good ones. And this relates a lot to what we call self-regulation. And in our current thinking about why people engage in sexual violence, front and center is this idea that people who fall off the path of good behavior are doing so because somehow they're not regulating themselves properly. With respect to sexual violence, it's not just the general self-regulation, but it's also the self-regulation. How do you get your sexual needs met, and are those things that you're doing acceptable? So, what is burnout? Burnout involves a physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion process that is largely attributable to stress. From the physical sense, it could be chronic fatigue or weakness or just a low energy, a feeling like you just don't want to get out of bed, you're just dragged out, that kind of thing. With respect to the mental component, or perhaps the cognitive element, it's where we start to have some highly negative attitudes towards ourselves, our work, and life in general. Where the physical part is about physical energy. Here we're talking about psychological energy. Do you have the sort of psychological wherewithal to engage in the natural things that you would do in your life? From the emotional standpoint, and these are our feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, feeling trapped, feeling like you have no other choice. And for people who experience extreme burnout, they'll have symptoms in perhaps all of these areas. Some of the things that are going to predict whether or not you are likely to fall prey to burnout, or whether or not you're maybe perhaps someone who's a little more resilient than others, will have to do with risk factors in both the workplace, and for Circle volunteers, when we talk about workplace, we're talking about the stuff you're doing in your circle. And then individual risk factors, things that pertain solely to you and your experience of that. In terms of workplace risk factors, some of the things that we look at are role ambiguity. So, what is a Circle volunteer, and what is a Circle volunteer's responsibilities? What's your role? What are you there for? What do we expect from you? What do you expect from yourself? What do you expect from the core member or from other people affiliated with your CoSA project? What is it that you are there for? And sometimes this is not entirely clear. And sometimes people get a little confused as to exactly what it is you're supposed to do. So it would be natural in some circles contexts for you to feel like you're sort of like a watchdog, I suppose, in that some of the things that you're talking about with your core member are things that you can identify from a layperson's standpoint are quite troubling, perhaps the sort of thing that needs to be acted on. One of the things that you'll get throughout your training as a volunteer is this notion that we rely on our Circle volunteers to do a lot of stuff, but there are some things we don't want you to do. And some of those things we don't want you to do is to behave like a professional. We want you to be professional in the things you do, but we don't want you to take on the role of a psychologist or a probation officer or law enforcement, any of those sorts of folks. We want you to remain in your role as a volunteer, knowledgeable about when it is important for you to ask somebody else to do something. So in terms of role ambiguity, it should be really clear to you what is expected of you as a circle volunteer, and you shouldn't be asked to do things that are not really within that sort of job description, as it were. Role conflict can also become something of an issue as well, and this is where the role you're playing conflicts with a role that you may play in another domain, or where you're being asked to do two things that aren't necessarily in sync with one another. And it's important for you to try to work these sorts of things out. And I would suggest that within the circle, as a discussion, if you're feeling that you're in some conflict, or that the expectations of you are in conflict with one another, that would be the sort of thing you could raise within the circle. You should also raise this with the circle project coordinator, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page and that everyone understands what it is that they're supposed to be doing. One of the things about working in a circle that you'll learn as you get more into volunteering is that there are some real rewards for being involved in a circle, but they're sometimes hard to find, and they're sometimes hard to put into context given some of the other things that are going on. Now, we certainly know that many of the people we have as our core members have a lot of difficulties in life. They've had a lot of trouble in their upbringing. They've had a lot of difficulties throughout. And sometimes it's easy to get caught up in all the things that have gone wrong and to forget about the little things that are going right. For instance, in our early circles, some of the people that we first worked with were people who had really, for all intents and purposes, spent most of their adult life in prison, with only very, very few and short periods of time in the community. The guy who was in the first circle, in fact, I think, as an adult, had never been free in the community for longer than 6 months. So it would be reasonable, when he gets to that first time that he's ever been 7 months in the community, that's a cause for celebration. There's a big pat on the back there, at least in some respects, for him and for his volunteers, and that he's now made it in the community longer than any other point in his adult history. And sometimes it's those small little victories, or if someone is able to remain sober for a month, never having been able to do that before, or if someone finally the light bulb goes off and they understand something you've been working on with them. These are small little things, but when you put them together, they come out to a fairly consistent sort of history of making small gains towards the bigger goal, which is overall community safety and no more victims. I think sometimes when we look at all the other stuff that's sort of going a little bit train wrecky, it's difficult to see the small stuff that's going right. And being a volunteer in a circle of support means that you're going to, at times, encounter core members who have a real difficult time making those small gains. But every time that you acknowledge one of them, it really does help them see that they can be people who succeed. The more that you reward them for those small gains, the more likely it is that they'll continue on the path towards the big gains. Workload can be another big risk factor that comes from being involved in a circles of support and accountability project. Make sure that you understand how much is enough. And I know that people who volunteer are sort of naturally inclined to say, sure, whatever I can do to help. Keep in mind that there is a breaking point, right? You do have a life external to CoSA. You do have people who are relying on you for things external to CoSA. There are responsibilities that you have external to CoSA, and that you need to make sure that there's a balance between those two. The natural tendency, if you're a good volunteer and if you're really effective, unfortunately people are going to ask you, can you take on another circle? Make sure that you really, really think about that, okay? Because being overworked or having too many responsibilities is a fundamental part of what leads to burnout. Being drawn in too many directions, having too many responsibilities. Those are all things that are ultimately going to work against how effective you can be as a volunteer and as a person in general. So make sure that you don't overload yourself. Sometimes it's difficult also when you're working with people who have engaged in various kinds of sexual violence. It's difficult to see what value your work is actually in terms of the grander scheme of things. In the recent past, we've seen an awful lot of discussion about sexual violence as the Hollywood scandals and stuff in the Senate and in Congress, and it seems like every time you turn on the television, you're hearing about some new person who's been accused of sexual harassment or sexual assault or some sort of sexual misbehavior. So you sort of look at it and you think to yourself, is what I'm doing really meaningful in any way? It seems like the problem's getting worse. Why am I doing this? Am I just wasting my time? And you may find, that others, when they find out that you volunteer to work with, with people who have engaged in this sort of behavior, they sort of look at you crosswise and say, wow, why would you do that? Those guys should be shot. They should be this, that, and the other thing. They should be locked up forever. And it sort of denigrates the work that you're doing. And I think it's really important, and I want you to listen to me here. What you do as volunteers is so critically important to public safety. It's also critically important to the well-being of your core members. Each and every guy that you volunteer with comes away from that experience a better person than they went into it. And although it may seem at times to be a drop in the bucket, enough drops in the bucket and all of a sudden you've got a full bucket, right? So it takes individuals like you to continue to do what you do to make that difference. And every once in a while, take the time to look at what you have accomplished as a volunteer and make sure that you recognize that your work is valuable. Because that sort of perception that you're having no effect or that your efforts are really just meaningless, that's also a part of how you get into burnout, and we don't want that to occur. The last workplace risk factor we're going to talk about is social support. And of course, circles of support and accountability are all about providing informed, balanced, sensible support to people who have engaged in sexual violence in the hope that they'll never do it again. But there's an upside for the rest of us as well, right? Because meeting together in groups, we get to share experiences with one another. And I've often heard from some of the volunteers that I've trained or that I've worked with that their being in the circle is as informative and educational for them as it often is for many of the core members who are in there trying to become better people. And as a natural consequence, many people who volunteer in circles come away from that experience as better people. So I think it's critically important for you to recognize that circle model wherein you sit there in a room with the core member and 3 to 5 other people sharing your experiences, sharing your perspectives, that in and of itself is burnout prevention. So make sure that you make the best use of the circle, and remember that you have that outer circle as well of informed professionals, whether they be psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, probation officers, law enforcement officers, victim advocacy folks. There's a wide variety of different people that you can rely on whenever you're starting to feel like you're slipping. So take advantage of that support element that's so fundamental to the circles of support and accountability endeavor. Individual risk factors, I think you'll see that there's an interplay between the workplace risk factors and the individuals. The first thing I want to talk about is sense of control. Working with a core member at times can be rather challenging because they don't quite yet necessarily know how to run their lives in a way that makes sense. And they're relying on you to a certain degree to help them make better choices. And sometimes it's difficult for them to identify or to recognize what those better choices might be. It's natural, I think, to want to engage in what folks in the motivational interviewing world call the writing reflex, which is the natural tendency for someone who has a pretty good idea that they know what the answer is to try to tell other people what that answer is before other people come to the realization of what the answer is for themselves. Right? It's the kind of thing, I can remember back when my son was younger and learning how to tie his shoes, and being in a hurry, watching him sort of fumble with it, and then saying, "Here, let me do that for you." That's the so-called writing reflex, trying to fix the problem. And he says, "No, I do it myself," meaning back off. Let me learn this. This is an important life skill. I'm not sure that that's what he really understood, but he's saying, "No, I don't need your help. I want you to let me do it for myself, or at least come to the conclusion." And, for me, the important part would be to recognize that I'd shown him how to do it, that he was doing it, although, obviously quite considerably more slowly than I wanted him to. But at the same time, I had to relax that sense of control and let him do it. And you'll find that if you stop always wanting to control things, or always needing to be right, or always needing to get the answer across, that you can see the process of learning in your core member, and it takes a lot of the stress off of you as well. Another risk factor that can be an issue is turnover. So when we put people into circles to be the volunteers, we have certain expectations, I guess, and we try to be real clear with our volunteers that we want you to think about this long and hard before you join a circle, because if you go into it for 4 or 5 sessions and then jump out, that could be potentially harmful to the whole process. We understand that sometimes things come up in people's lives and they don't have the option or whatever to stick in a circle once they've started it. But it's really important that you think about that in advance, because once a circle is started, bonds of trust and honesty and those sorts of things start to build. And when somebody leaves, there are always questions about why did so-and-so leave, who's going to replace him or her, what's that person going to be like, and how is that going to change the dynamic of the circle. And sometimes the frustration you experience of things always changing can be really difficult. Keep in mind also that depending on who your core member is, the institutional experience that he might have had, especially with respect to treatment, may have been that he had a long string of different therapists, and that once he got used to a therapist or a case manager, that person moved on, got promoted, moved to another facility, quit, whatever, and that led to a lot of uncertainty for him. So, and that can have an effect on the circle itself. So certainly turnover is an issue. One of the things that a lot of people who are volunteers in circles have talked about is, what's the organizational framework? Who's in charge? Who's driving the bus, so to speak? And is the organizational commitment to the support and accountability aspects of CoSA, is the organizational commitment to that as strong as that of its volunteers? And sometimes people question whether or not what they have in mind and what the organization has in mind are the same thing. And sometimes there's a lot of frustration that comes out of that. So it's important for Circle Project volunteers to be in touch with their Circle volunteers, maintaining some degree of knowledge and understanding of what's going on in circles, and to make sure that the organizational commitment is in line with the individual commitments of the Circle volunteers themselves. Perception of fairness is also an important thing that needs to be considered. And here it's Does the process make sense? Does it appear fair? Is it in line with your sort of worldview? The best way to get around this is to really make sure that everything is transparently discussed within the circle. To make sure that everyone understands what's going on, why it's going on that way, and what different options there may be if there are different options. And to, for everyone to have an opportunity to share their perspective before a decision is made. And sometimes that's a little difficult to do because sometimes our core members engage in behavior that means that we have to act in a certain way. Perhaps call the police, perhaps call their probation officer, maybe take them to hospital because they represent a threat to themselves. There are times when we need to intervene, perhaps in a somewhat strenuous way or a sort of high level way that sort of makes it necessary to act before there's an awful lot of discussion. But what I would say is important to do after the fact there is to make sure that people who are involved in that circle sit down and debrief afterwards. Talk about what happened, why it happened, and what things you could do differently in the future to help avoid the issue in the first place, or to make sure that if it happens again, that that everyone understands what it is that needs to be done. Working in a circle can sometimes challenge our values and attitudes. It's safe to say that we have volunteers from all walks of life, and we have core members from all walks of life. Sometimes our core members' life experience is so dramatically different from ours that they have very, very different values and attitudes perhaps than we do. And sometimes it's kind of trying to figure out which ones you should care about and which ones probably really don't matter that much. So certainly we want our volunteers to be open-minded and to consider that there are a wide variety of different perspectives that might be quite reasonable, even though they may not be the ones that you have, but that taking a live and let live kind of approach to things is probably the best. Sometimes core members will have values and attitudes that are diametrically opposed to yours. The reality is that some of our core members are quite antagonistic to women. Some of our core members are flat out racist. Some of our core members have very, very strong beliefs about religion and perhaps spirituality. And sometimes we have to leave our morals perhaps, or some of our mores, maybe not so much our morals, but what we think about the world. We may need to check a little bit of that at the door when we go into a circle meeting and get to know the person before we start trying to deconstruct whatever values and attitudes they have. Some of those things are perhaps not quite as important as no more victims. As much as we don't want people to be racist, I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of people who have racist views out there in the world who are not engaging in any kind of sexual violence. So being a racist and being someone who engages in that sort of behavior are probably not strongly correlated. We ultimately want our core members to be good, healthy, fun people to be around. But the first and most important thing that we have in a circle is to make sure that there are no more victims. So what you think about the world and what your core member thinks about the world, and perhaps even what some of your other circle volunteers think about the world, may not necessarily always be the same thing. I'll give you an example. So I've been working with circles of support for about almost 24 years now. So that means that I was involved in the first circle way back in the beginning. And circles of support has always had a strong faith-based approach to it. Most of the circle project coordinators are people of faith. Many of the volunteers are people of faith. Many of the circles themselves are, circles projects, and the places where they meet are in churches or other, buildings associated with faith groups. And yet, I'm an atheist. So here I am, a person who does not believe in a higher power, who is surrounded by people who do. And, it's never been an issue. It really hasn't. We take a real live and let live type approach to things. This is not about converting people. That is CoSA. CoSA is not about converting people. CoSA is about increasing community safety, increasing the likelihood that our core members are going to enjoy healthy and productive lives going forward. And if you believe in God, or if you believe in whatever, that's entirely up to you, and where you have those beliefs in common with others, great, feel free to discuss that, but it shouldn't be an issue about whether or not we can continue to do the work that we do. And for me, being an atheist surrounded by a whole pile of different people of faith has never been an issue. We both have the same goals. We may come at them slightly differently, but we have the same goals. The last thing I want to talk about with respect to individual risk factors are, to what degree do you have healthy coping skills and ways to deal with situations that cause you grief or cause you concern. We try to select our volunteers because of certain qualities. One of those is we want to know that you're generally level-headed, that you've got some reasonable common sense, and that for the most part you're a relatively balanced and healthy person, to the extent possible. And let's face it, nobody's perfect, right? Me, I'm not perfect. Certainly, I'm sure nobody watching this video would truly consider themselves to be perfect. There are times when you're going to have to deal with things, and having reasonable coping skills, knowing what to do with stress, how to manage it, those are the sorts of things we're going to talk about as we continue in this video. So, people are at less risk for burnout when they feel that they have a degree of control over their situation, if they believe they're being treated fairly, and if they and others value the work that's being done and share an equal amount of overall commitment to it. So there's safety in numbers, right? Part of what you hear here is that working together, we can accomplish things, right? And that's essentially at the heart of the circles of support and accountability idea, that we work together as a team, or that we group together as a kind of collective to work together towards solving a problem. And for us, that problem is the issue of sexual violence in our communities. One of the things that you may experience as a volunteer is what we call vicarious trauma. This is also referred sometimes as a kind of compassion fatigue, or kind of co-victimization, secondary survivors, emotional contagion, and it speaks to the cost of caring. So as people who work or who volunteer in a circle with those who have engaged in behaviors that can be quite troubling, how much of that rubs off on you? The old saying, if you look into the abyss, what's going to look back out at you? Vicarious trauma is a human phenomenon. I'm assuming that you chose to volunteer in a circle because you have empathy. You have empathy for both victims and also for the people who perpetrated those acts. But because you have empathy, that means that you're going to hear things and take on a little bit of that sort of distress that gets conveyed when people tell their stories, whether it's the offenders or the people who were the victims. So it's natural for you to experience a certain amount of distress when you hear about stuff that's naturally troubling, right? Whether it happened to a victim, or perhaps even at times when the core member is talking about his own developmental history and some of the adverse childhood experiences that he had when he was young. So as a person who has the capacity to empathize, you're going to hear that and you're going to be naturally troubled by some of it. We know that people who are at high risk for this experience are those sorts of people who interview and who counsel people who have been involved in trauma, so victims, people who've experienced really traumatic situations, people who work with the families of victims and those victims within the family context, and people who work with people who have been abused in a wide variety of different settings. And, of course, there's certainly overlap between those three groups. But the sort of people that we're talking about here are, people who work as a kind of mental health counselors, health and hospital staff, emergency workers, people who work in kind of children's aid or perhaps kind of child protection services, people who work within kind of forensic criminological domains like prisons or jails or high security hospitals. Here in the United States, that would include some of the civil commitment centers. People who work in kind of local law enforcement, sheriff's deputies, state troopers, police officers, sometimes people who work as kind of security guards might also be affected. And of course, volunteers, right? Volunteers who work with people who engage in these sorts of behaviors, or people who have been the victims of these sorts of behaviors, can also be people who are greatly affected with respect to vicarious trauma. When we experience vicarious trauma, basically this is a challenge to ourselves, to our core beliefs about what we believe about the world. What's meaningful, what has value, and to hear some of the things that we hear really challenges our belief that the world is a good place and that it's full of generally good people. And we have to remember that these are the sorts of experiences that we're specifically in a circle to try to help have some effect on. So given that we have a core member who has perhaps a really tremendously horrible life experience from his own perspective, with all sorts of adverse childhood experiences when he was young, who found himself involved in crime as a youth, started taking advantage of people, from a sexual perspective, and ultimately found himself caught up in the whole kind of criminal justice experience, with all of the the potential pitfalls that comes along with that as well. That's an awful lot, right? And it's an awful lot that may not be part of your personal experience as someone who grew up in a relatively happy home, went to school, graduated, went to college if you did that, got a job, found someone, got married, maybe had children. All of those sort of negative experiences and horrible things that are associated with aspects of what you're going to hear about when you're in a circle meeting don't maybe make much sense to you, or that they're so sort of diametrically opposed to your own experience that the shock of it is part of the vicarious trauma experience. And just sort of thinking to yourself, oh my God, how could somebody possibly have had that experience and come out of it to the extent that they did. Vicarious trauma is a normal human consequence of secondhand exposure to things that are essentially traumatic. So, just as much as we talked about risk factors from the perspective of sort of workplace experience and the individual stuff, talking about some of the mediators of a secondary trauma stress effect are also important, because this also gives us some sense of where we might want to focus if we're going to try to prevent people from experiencing problems with respect to burnout and kind of vicarious trauma. In terms of individual factors, it has an awful lot to do with what our experience was. And clearly, someone who has a history of having been a sexual abuse victim as a child or as an adult will come into a volunteering situation in a CoSA, perhaps with a different set of values and attitudes than people who haven't had that experience. So how much trauma you've experienced in your life will obviously have some influence on how well you deal with the trauma that you hear in listening to your core member talk about whatever it is that he ends up talking about. Losses that you've experienced in life, situations where you've been taken advantage of, all of those could potentially be in some way triggered by being involved in a circle. Your personality type and how defensive you are in certain situations. Are you the sort of person who responds poorly to certain things, or are you the kind of person who can be a little more even-tempered? And certainly either of which could be quite reasonable depending on the circumstance. But how are you likely to respond to certain situations given your own personal background, your own personal style, and your sort of personality orientation? Certainly talking about coping. How do you cope? Some people are really good at coping, some people are not so good at coping. Some people cope by doing things that are perhaps good in the short term, but not particularly good in the long term. So if your coping style is to have a big martini, and certainly many of us have been known to do that at times, and that's reasonable, I suppose, to a certain degree. But if every time you experience any kind of stress you sort of hit the bottle, ultimately that may not be all that helpful for you. So being able to explore different ways to cope with stress and with that vicarious trauma is a worthwhile enterprise. And it's the sort of thing that you can even talk about within your circle. Your current life context may also have an awful lot to do with how well you respond to stress. How well are things going for you right now? Are you backed up at work? Is one of your kids having difficulty with something? Did you just have a fight with your spouse or your partner, whatever you call him or her? What happens in your private life can affect what happens in your circle life, and indeed it will affect you in virtually every part of your life. One of the things that I can tell you for absolutely certain is that when you're under stress and when you're feeling overworked or when you're feeling overburdened, that's not the time to make big life decisions. Stress impacts how well we think things through, and understanding how our current life context affects how we behave or how we react in other circumstances is a really important thing to take into consideration. Training and professional history, also very important in terms of how well we're going to respond to certain situations of stress. Hopefully, by watching this short video and by talking about things in your circle and by perhaps doing some of the reading, if you get the actual PowerPoint, there is there is a suggested reading list at the end, things that you might want to consider having a look at. In some of our circles, we'll have some volunteers who may have had some professional experience. It's not uncommon for us to have people who are social workers or perhaps retired psychologists or retired law enforcement, people who, after they finish working, decide that they'd like to volunteer in a circle. And sometimes it's really great to have those folks in a circle because they can provide some guidance and advice. So, certainly if you have any professional history of being able to manage stress and that kind of thing, perhaps in your circles you can take a bit of a leadership role when situations pop up that could potentially be damaging to others. One of the things you also may want to consider at some point, if you've got a really sort of troubled history, I suppose, or if you've got things that you think you need to work through, as much as we suggest to our core members that sometimes going to therapy is not a bad idea, or that perhaps getting a little bit of treatment would be helpful, or taking the time to debrief something in a more professional context, we would certainly recommend that as well. And that's the sort of thing that you can talk to your circle's project coordinator about, or perhaps if there is a psychologist or psychiatrist or social worker, mental health counselor, whatever, who is affiliated with your circle, they may be able to give you some ideas as well. In terms of the situational factors, and you'll notice that some of these sorts of things are very similar to what we talked about for burnout period. But workload. How much volunteering are you doing, and how well does that fit into your life with all the other stuff you're doing? It's been my experience that people who end up volunteering tend to take on an awful lot because they have that big open heart and they want to do a lot of good in the world, and sometimes that's not the world's best choice. The nature of the work certainly wears on us. We're working with some core members who at times can be pretty high in the risk continuum and pretty high with respect to needs as well. They tend to be very needy. Those needs tend to be complex, and sometimes they can be very heartbreaking as well. The nature of the clientele, absolutely an issue for us sometimes. Some of our core members are not the nicest people. Certainly the first couple of guys who were in circles, both Charlie and Ray, were ornery, they were objectionable, they were very difficult at times to talk to, but we never let that get in the way. I guess at times it made it more difficult to do the work, but at the same time, our ultimate goal was that there be no more victims, and for both of those guys, there never were any more victims, in spite of the fact that everybody expected them to engage in lots and lots more bad sexual behavior shortly after they were released, and neither one of them did. So that was a real testament to the circles who worked with those two guys. Keep in mind that there is a cumulative effect of your exposure as well, right? The more of this you hear, it's like it kind of builds up. So you have to have some sort of a steam valve, I suppose, to let some of this stuff go. And I would say that most circles projects should have something like a circle celebration day, an annual event or a biannual event, something that happens with some regularity when people who are involved in circles can get together and celebrate the fact that they're making a difference in their individual communities. I think this is really helpful in helping people to understand what differences they're making in the world, and to see all those small little bits that I talked about a few moments ago, see how they all come together into one big bit. Your relationships with the other volunteers in your circle, with other people who are involved in your circle's project, and with the people on the outer circle, and with your circle's project coordinator, those are all really important relationships that need to be cultivated, I suppose, to a certain degree. How well you get along with everyone, how much you feel like a group of people who are working together towards a common goal, will help to insulate you against some of those vicarious trauma effects. The social and cultural context can sometimes be meaningful as well. Depending on where you are, depending on who you're working with, you may find yourself working with a core member who comes from a vastly different cultural experience than yours, or who has a different view of the world. And we talked a little bit about this before as well. Circles of support and accountability is not about making our core members into kind of homogeneous, good little people. That's not the intent. The intent is to help them understand the consequences of their behavior, and to help them realize that there's a different way to live their life, and that it doesn't need to include any kind of violence towards others, or even violence towards themselves. Okay, so the social context, the cultural context, is something that you need to be open-minded about. While at the same time, and I haven't said this yet, but let's say it now. There are times when maybe the fit just isn't there, right? Maybe you're not well positioned in the circle you're in. Maybe there's something about somebody in that circle, one of the other volunteers or the core member himself, that you just can't seem to get past. If you come to that conclusion after having given it an honest shot, I would suggest that you talk to the Circle Project volunteer and say, hey, you know what? I'm still really, really keen to volunteer, but I just don't know that I'm being effective in this circle. And through some discussions with that project coordinator, you may come to some conclusions. Maybe it's true that that's maybe not the best place for you. That's kind of getting along the lines of this last bit that I want to talk about, which is supervision. Now, when people hear the word supervision, they often think about that sort of annual review point where they get their performance appraisal from their boss, or where they get their report card at school or something like that, where someone gives them feedback about how well they think they're doing. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm also not talking about somebody looking over your shoulder, making sure that you're doing it the right way. When we talk about supervision here, we're talking about it more in a kind of clinical sense. People who go into the mental health field, when they do their internship sorts of things, their kind of practica, those sorts of things where they go and do some on-the-job training, frequently they'll meet with their supervisor once a week to talk about the experience. Not to hear how many times they did things wrong or how many times they did things right, but to actually sit down and talk about the process and how being involved in it has an effect on both you as a person and the people that you're working with. And if there are things that are causing you concern or things that you want to debrief, that's your opportunity. This kind of supervision doesn't need to be done with someone who is higher up the food chain than you. It could be with a colleague. It could be debriefing with one of your other circle volunteers. It could be with someone who's perhaps not even affiliated with the CoSA project, someone whose opinions, whose feedback, whose guidance you value. It's the opportunity for you to sit down and talk about your experience with someone who's not going to judge you or kind of do any kind of performance appraisal on how you talk about that experience. And this, I think, is a really critically important part of making sure that you insulate yourself against vicarious trauma and also ultimately against burnout. Having the chance to talk about things that are happening for you, to get the pats on the back for having worked things through well, and to get good advice for things that you need some help on, that's, I think, a critically important part of being a healthy person and being a healthy volunteer. When you start to experience vicarious trauma, or when you're starting to head down the pathway to burnout, there are certain things that you might experience. So you can see some slide with respect to your physical health. Okay? Changes in weight, either you're gaining weight or you're losing weight, sometimes are a sign that something is causing you some concern. Anxiety, just feeling stressed out, feeling a little bit on edge. If you're frequently hearing from your partner or from your friends or whatever, hey, you seem a little on edge, what's going on for you? These are the sorts of bits of feedback that are suggesting to you that maybe stress is having a toll on you. And while that stress may come from a wide variety of different places, as a circle volunteer, you may want to consider how much of the stress you're experiencing may be coming from your experience of being in a circle. Depression, certainly if things aren't going well with your core member, to the extent that you empathically take some of that on, you may experience a little bit of depression. We also know that sometimes people who are prone to using alcohol and perhaps other substances, if you have a history of having done that in an unhealthy way in the past, it's possible that stress coming from being involved in a circle could be expressed in that way as well. So just keeping those sorts of things in check, I think, are really important. Also, how you view and experience others. being in a circle sometimes can change your worldview, change how you feel about certain things. Certainly I know, having been in this business for as long as I have, that when I read newspaper stories about people who have engaged in bad sexual conduct, who seem not to be held accountable for that, that really irks me. Sometimes you hear things from people that you have in social circles where they'll say something and you think, oh my God, how could that person possibly believe that? I think sometimes we have to remember that our experience of the world may not be the same as the experiences that everyone else has had, and that our knowledge base may be different, and that may cause some differences in belief systems, perspectives, and certainly how we feel about other people. I think at times we have to sort of keep in check how much we're going to try to force our own worldview onto other people. You can, I suppose, gently inform them about the realities of certain things. If someone has a view that is perhaps not supported by scientific perspective that you learned because of your involvement in circles, you can certainly inform that person. But to get into an argument about it solely because you know something to be true and the other person maybe doesn't have that same knowledge base, probably isn't good for you and isn't good for your relationships with others. Your own personal self-esteem. The reality is that if you continue to volunteer in circles, that there's a point at which one of your core members may experience difficulty. He may get violated or breached for having done something against the rules of his release, or he may get caught for engaging in other criminal behavior, and the worst case scenario is that one of your core members may go on to engage in further acts of sexual violence. It's important for you at that point to recognize that you didn't make him do that, and that you're not responsible for his actions. To the extent possible, you've been working with him in his circle, talking about healthy lifestyles and balance and self-determinism, and ultimately it's up to the core member to take that support and that overall accountability framework and to incorporate it into his life so that he lives a more healthy way. Some of our core members have a difficult time doing that. And certainly we know that just because our goal is to have no more victims doesn't mean that we always meet that goal. And I think it's critically important for you as a volunteer in a circle to be able to recognize that it's not about you, that the choice to engage in new sexually violent behavior was the choice of the core member. So, what does stress do to us? So, stress can affect our bodies in a number of different ways. It can affect our immune system. And you probably recognize this, in your life, that when you're sort of dragged out and overworked and when you're overburdened, that you seem to, shortly thereafter get a cold, or that you experience other difficulties, with respect to sickness. And certainly we know that stress affects our immune system. It also affects our hormones, right? I mean, stress hormones, certainly, there's an emerging literature about cortisol and the effects that it has on us. And certainly stress can lead to difficulties with respect to our heart, it's kind of cardiovascular stuff. All of these are good reasons why you're well advised to debrief situations that are causing you stress. So if something is stressful within the circle should try to discuss that. If you yourself are experiencing stress, whether in the circle or external to the circle, and you want to go and talk with someone, I would certainly support that. And that goes back to that sort of friendly supervision idea that I talked about a few minutes ago. There's some literature that has been published around what the experiences are for people who are volunteers with people who have engaged in sexual violence. One of our colleagues from Holland published a paper talking about the effects of volunteering with people who have sexually offended. And there are certainly some positive effects in that the volunteering process had positive effects on people's physical health and their overall mental well-being. It helped them to feel like they were growing personally, and it also contributed to a sense of overall citizenship. And I don't talk about where you have to go and pledge allegiance and all that kind of stuff. Here I'm talking about how much you feel like part of the larger collective, and that you are somehow contributing to the greater well-being of your nation, of your community, of your social group, all of those things. How much are you feeling like you're actively engaged in the process of being a citizen? We also know, and we've talked about this at other points in this video, that volunteering with people who have engaged in sexually violent acts can have a real effect on you if you're naturally empathic. It can cause you a number of different effects that we've talked about. Sometimes the experience is positive, obviously, or else we wouldn't be encouraging you to do it. But obviously there are times when things don't go that way. And we've talked about it throughout this video, as these effects are moderated by who you are as a person, what it is that you're being expected to do, and what the characteristics are of the organization you're involved in. In general, it's been my experience that circles of support and accountability projects have been very well oriented towards both community safety and also personal accountability for behavior, and that's ultimately been a good thing for both the project and for others. Mitigation factors. So the first question is, how well are you taking care of yourself? Are there opportunities for self-care within the Circles framework? And to my knowledge and experience, there generally is. That's part of the function of the Circle, is to debrief things and to talk things through. And certainly having training videos like this or other training experiences where people can talk about what's good for them, what's healthy for them, so on and so forth, very important. Self-care in your personal life is also really important. So it's not just what you do within the Circles framework, but it's also what you do for yourself, right? Do you look after yourself? Do you interact with others? Do you debrief with your important people in your life? Who are your significant social supports? Family, friends, partners. Those are the sorts of people that you want to talk to. I strongly believe in a holistic approach. My favorite phrase is balanced, self-determined lifestyle. I use that term in virtually everything I write, and I try to say it as often as possible, partly because I'm also aspiring to that myself. You want to be balanced. Give yourself a little bit of time to experience all of the great things that make life what it is. A little bit of work, a little bit of play, a little bit of time for yourself, a little bit of time with others, right? It's a wide variety of different things that you need to keep in mind, and leisure is often one that people forget about. Self-determination is also critically important. How much do you get to make decisions for yourself, and how often are the decisions you make good ones, right? And do you have a means by which to assess whether or not the decisions that you're making are actually helpful for you and others? This is critically important for our core members, and it's one of the things that we work strongly with them to try to get them to, but also remember that these sorts of things apply to you too. What's good for the goose is also good for the gander. Balance and priorities. So being a helpful volunteer requires you to espouse and believe in the same values and attitudes that you're trying to instill in your core member. So you want to talk about things like health, What happens in your household? What's in your family relationships? What's going on in your other social relationships? Do you have an opportunity to engage in some physical activity or some recreation? Do you have an opportunity to be creative, right? Do you like to cook? Do you like to build something? Do you do hobby craft stuff? Something along those lines. What's the meaning of your life? Are you spiritual? Do you have any sort of existential pursuits or things like that? Do you have a job? What do you do? Do you have a profession? Do you have a career? Is there something about you that sort of defines you because of what you've done? I mean, I'm a sexual violence preventer. I've done this for 33 and a half years now. It's part of who I am as a person. I don't think I can any longer separate myself from what I do. I suppose there are times when I'd really like to, but because I believe in my work and because I believe in safer communities and in people who are self-actualized, I've sort of taken that on. It's part of me as a person. And probably you also, as a volunteer, see yourself as a fundamentally helpful person, right? So, being able to sort of celebrate what you're doing and to understand why you're doing it and why it's important is a really big part of being a volunteer. Social and community involvement, well, that's what you're doing, right? You're a volunteer in a circle of support and accountability. That's a big thing, right? You've taken on a challenge that not an awful lot of people would. And it's fair to say that when we try to start up new circles projects, it's not like there's a queue of people around the block waiting to be volunteers. Sometimes we have to work very, very hard to find people who can volunteer in a circle. And it's part and parcel of why we want you to look after yourselves. Because once you've decided to do this, you become a very, very valuable person to your personal community, and we want to make sure that you can continue to do so in a healthy way. The more balanced we are across the full range of personal care, the more able we are to cope with stress and to face the demands that will be there if you're going to be an effective volunteer. So we want to make sure that being part of a circle isn't something that drags you down, but rather something that increases your self-esteem, increases your beliefs in yourself as someone who's part of the solution and not part of the problem, and to be able to look at the gains that your core members make and to celebrate that part that you played in that overall process. So I'd like to end with something that's perhaps a little hokey, and I think it's important to recognize that being healthy is actually a lot simpler than I think most of us really realize. And being good and kind-hearted people who are effective in our relationships with others, sometimes I think the simplicity of it maybe gets a little overlooked. More than 30 years ago, a fellow whose name is Robert Fulghum published a book that's become quite famous, and it's called All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And what Mr. Fulghum says is, most of what I really need to know about how to live and what to do and how to be, I learned in kindergarten. Wisdom was not at the top of the graduate school mountain, but there in the sandbox at nursery school. These are the things I learned. Share everything. Play fair. Don't hit people. Put things back where you found them. Clean up your own mess. Don't take things that aren't yours. Say sorry when you hurt somebody. Wash your hands before you eat. Flush. Warm cookies and cold milk are good for you. Live a balanced life. Take a nap every afternoon. When you go out into the world, watch for traffic, hold hands, and stick together. Pretty simple stuff, but I think, putting it into context of what we've been talking about within the context of this video, there's an awful lot of helpful information there. And with that, I'm going to sign off and say thank you for watching. And if you have any questions about this, please feel free to shoot me an email. My email address is on my on the homepage of my website, and I'll remind you what that is. It's www.robinjwilson.com, and that's where you'll also find the PowerPoint that goes along with this video. It'll be under the Circles of Support and Accountability tab. Thank you for your time.